Well, hey there, sweet peas. Welcome back to Friendless. I'm your pal, James Avraменko, popping in ahead of the main interview just to quickly lay the scene. This episode is the latest in my series of collaborations with the Book Warehouse on Main Street. And this week, I'm joined by the author Iona Wishaw to discuss her latest entry in her series of 13 books and growing. The latest is called A False and Fatal Claim. A quick note, I had some unexpected tech issues with the recording. I've done my best to clean up the audio, but unfortunately there are still a few spots where things get a little wonky. I apologize in advance. But on the positive side, the interview itself is an absolute treat that I know you're going to love. So that's it from me. Enjoy the episode.
So here's the thing about friendship. It requires a certain amount of delusion. You meet someone, you decide on basically no evidence that they're safe, that they will not disappoint you, betray you, or vanish without explanation. You hand them a little piece of yourself and hope for the best. And most of the time, it works out. But sometimes the person you trusted turns out to be someone else entirely. Sometimes the community you thought you knew has been keeping secrets. Sometimes the hat abandoned in the brush is the beginning of something much worse than a hat. That last one is from today's guest. Iona Wishaw is the author of the Lane Winslow Mystery series. 13 books set in post-war British Columbia, where a small lakeside community keeps insisting it's idyllic right up until the moment it's absolutely not. Her brand new novel is A False and Fatal Claim, and I really can't think of a more friendless title than that. Iona, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
Right off the bat, a question I like to set up for all guests is a very simple but potentially hazardous question of who the hell are you?
Well, it's hard to know what to say about who you are. You're either the long string of things you've done or you're the long string of people you came from. I would have to say right now, I'm definitely a writer. Because I started so late, I was 64 when I started this particular series, and in general started because I was an educator before. It's really over the last decade that I've been writing, transformed from an educator into a writer, and in some ways back into a little bit of an educator as well.
So let's chat a little bit first about the newest book, A False and Fatal Claim. It puts trust really front and center. And I'm curious, what kind of false claims are you most interested when you are plotting a novel like this? Is it the ones that people make to each other or the ones that they make to themselves?
I think I should mention that I don't plot.
Okay, fantastic.
I just write. So I'm always quite interested when people are not honest about themselves to themselves. They're making their faults to themselves in some ways, right? I think that can happen. Like in this book, for example, there's a guy who slings hat in the cafe in Nelson, gets offered a job by a really wealthy person to be a driver. And it's like transformative in his life. The first time he has a suit, he has a hat, he has all those things, but he's still himself.
Yeah.
And he's struggling to be the person he thinks he is in these new clothes. I'm the driver because he's on such unsettled ground. He ends up becoming a victim. He ends up becoming a criminal because he doesn't actually know who he is. Right. If somebody asked him, who are you? Or who are you? As you had, and he would have struggled to answer it beyond a very,
And do you find that, do you think that that's a more natural instinct for people to sort of lie to themselves? Or do they think that they're doing more protectively around how they are perceived by others?
What do you think? When you think about the question, who are you? I think most people would have difficulty answering it. And I think that's where the problem lies, because you define yourself all the time. Like right now, I'm the person who's talking to you. And I think people often, it's harder for them to think beyond that, deeper than that. Because who are you must, I think, to be really solid, must encompass what you believe, right? And I think people live lives where they don't have to examine their beliefs a lot.
Yeah.
Less so right now in our society. Sure. Everyone's having to examine what they believe now. Yeah. But, 10 years ago, we lived in a comfortable Western society.
There was no pushback on anything.
And there was not that much pushback. So, yeah, I think, and people are easily duped. That's the other thing,
Yes,
I think that's a really big problem, people being duped. And they're duped because they're not on solid ground themselves. Like the number of letters I get that are from scammers.
Oh, yeah.
Are unbelievable.
Yeah.
They're eloquent. And they're shifting how they do it. And we're just looking for,
Just one little in and then you're,
I think a lot of people, I don't mean writers necessarily, but a lot of people are drawn into these things because they're uncertain about who they are and they're uncertain about what to do in a situation.
Yeah. Well, and it's that drive for connection. I often find the people who I've known who have fallen for scams and things like that, more often than not, it's not 100%, but more often than not, they've been in moments of isolation. They've been moments where it's like, oh, here's somebody contacting me. Here's somebody connecting to me, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think in this book, there's a kind of elaborate scam going on all the way through it, right? There's somebody who's pretending to be somebody totally else the entire time. And when I think about Lane's neighbors, it's a mixed bag. And there's some neighbors who don't get along at all. Other neighbors who are very content to be just the people who, they've had their one adventure, for example, in the Hughes family, elderly mother and two, upper middle-aged daughters. Yeah. They both had tragic love affairs, the two daughters. The mother's husband died. And there's no impetus on the part of any of them to change that. Neither girl ever fell in love again. Mother never married again. They settled into this life, and that's how they want it to go on.
But that, in a way, is a formation of their own community, right? Right? Yeah.
That community is incredible because I lived in that community when I was a child, and I could leave my house in the morning, 5 or 6 years old, and wander to the post office or up the hill to the people whom I modeled on the Hughes, or off to the American, and everywhere people would give me tea and something to eat and entertain me and put me down for a nap. It was unbelievable. And because they were largely English, they had a very kind of non-sentimental approach to life.
Sure, yeah.
Gladys Hughes would never sentimentalize anything, speaks straight up, and everything is absolute rotten nonsense. And, it's just, but underneath it, there's that real level of caring. Like if somebody needs something or, they come together, like I think in this book, Ames is having a drinks party prior to his marriage. And so they're throwing it at Lane's house. And Lane is not a cook, is, a little worried about it. And the Hugheses leap into the breach. Oh, we'll do it. We'll make all the can. Don't you worry about a thing. We'll do it. Oh, I can't think, which is nonsense. Love to do it.
Yeah,
so you get that going on in the community all the time.
So this leads me into this question of the idea of Kingscope, and the idea of the idyllic surface, right? And the people who want to be just within a community, and are participating in that way. But then that doesn't necessarily make for interesting fiction, right? You then have to have problems and you have to have some modicum of darkness in a lot of ways. And I'm curious, so you've said you don't necessarily plot it out as you're writing, but as you are exploring the story and as it's kind of coming out of you, how do you find yourself calibrating the level of darkness or whatever it might be? How much do you let in before it feels like you are no longer working within the community that you've built?
In a way, you're talking about how I might betray the community as a writer.
Yeah.
It's very interesting because the worst thing that happened in that community, in a way, happens in the first book.
Okay.
And I don't really do that again. Yeah. And in that first book, the guy who now lives alone at the turnoff in the road, Paris, marries a young woman, goes off to war.
Right.
And the guy up the road takes advantage of her in really, really bad winter. In the end, the guy comes back, Paris comes back from war, his wife's left him, and they have a terrible fight. And now they just live very distantly, one at the bottom of the road and one at the top.
Yeah.
They try to go to the post office at different times, and when they end up at the same event, they try to
be on the other side of the room.
Be on the other side of the room, And I don't have really done anything that hard since first, really, because I've grown fond of the community. I want them to be safe. And, there are darknesses in their lives. In the third book, we find out all about the Hughes family and the two Hughes women and what happened. And, it's a dark and ugly story. But they're survivors. They're gardeners, bakers, workers. The other thing that's interesting about that community, and probably most rural communities, is how strong the women are. I mean, those are 3 women left by the First World War, and the Second War has just happened. And lots of women have been left and are having to carry on, sometimes with children, looking after the family and all that kind of thing. So it's kind of an extraordinary testament. The war was, and then post-war.
The conflict, too, of, they had just maintained that community for the better part of, really, if you're looking at both wars combined, the last 40, 50 years, it had been female-led and female held up.
Yeah, no. And I think the other interesting thing about the community is it's largely English, right? They're all from the old country. And then Lane comes along. She's a new immigrant from the old country, and they embrace her immediately. But they still call the American the Yank.
Yes.
And they, of course, do accept her, and they love her. But it's the running joke, that, the Americans.
Yeah.
So different from us, sort of thing. But, they're going to have to incorporate new people as they come into the community. So they've had to embrace Darling when he marries and comes into the community.
Lane comes to Kingscope pretty explicitly to be alone and to kind of recover and to isolate in a lot of ways. But now, 13 books later, she's, embedded in not only a marriage, but in this complete community. And I'm wondering, do you think that, from her perspective, do you think that she got what she was originally kind of looking for, or did she sort of discover something new along the way? And this is leading me into a sort of a deeper exploration of building community, but I think starting...
the thing is, that's what Lane came for. And we have in some ways to take into account Lane's own upbringing.
Yes.
Like, it was interesting, I saw Friendless, like she in fact grew up very... her father was horrible to her. Her mother was dead. She had apprentices, a great aunt who was harsh. And in some ways, my mother and Lane in this regard are quite similar. So Lane comes there and she thinks she wants to be alone, but she's immediately confronted by these lovely people across the road in the post office who are so warm and so absolutely accepting. I think that really begins to make Lane's original goal less about just being alone, but about learning to be cared for.
Yes.
Because in some ways, she never really had that growing up, And, she's a good, sturdy person who has a good, strong sense of herself and could have gone along really nicely. She might have married somebody if she hadn't come to, and that might have been a mistake for her.
Sure.
But because she comes into this place where she finds this acceptance and this friendship, and, it's a bit easy for her because they're English.
Right.
And they're English about how they
let in other English, basically. Right?
I think, she found something that she hadn't bargained for that was really an antidote.
I ask because it's something that I've been exploring in the solo episodes of the show recently, is this idea of when you are feeling impulses of isolation or you're wanting to withdraw, that ends up making the loneliness or whatever it is you're running from worse, And so often the sort of antidote, as much as it might not instinctually feel like it, the way to lessen that is to be the one who reaches out, be the one who contacts or build a community, basically, right?
I think one of the reasons that the books perhaps are popular is because they do just move us a bit back into a time when we didn't have technology.
Yeah.
Lots of people weren't even in the phone yet.
Yes.
It took until the 50s for most to get haunted.
Yeah. And that's just to have a home phone.
So it's a lot harder to isolate themselves in those days because there's always people. and they're humans and they're with you, and you go there and you have to go to the post office and, rushed in for a cup of tea and whatever's just been made. And you just sort of go along with it. It's much harder to hide up.
I think you've just tapped into something. It's something I've been really ruminating on a lot lately, is this idea of because I was born in that generation that's in that funny little middle ground. I got the internet when I was kind of in junior high age, and I didn't have my first cell phone until, almost university. So, I had this childhood without it, but I still came up in it, So I kind of, straddle both sides. And I wonder about, even for someone like me at this point now, it's like, I used to go out, I used to socialize, I used to have no problem going out to, not even just, to say a party or something, but just going out and doing things, going out to the movies. And now it's like, I feel a panic when I have to go down the street, and just go to the grocery store or something, Can't imagine what it's like for younger generations who have just been raised completely in this really isolating technology. I think you really tapped into something around you were used to people being around because they had to be there, right? So it just, it sort of trains your nervous system in a way that, it's not that something like COVID, it's not that lockdown caused all this. I think it just revealed that was the way things were going, and it kind of accelerated it all, right?
And I remarked to myself about how much of an effort it's going to be to go to a movie.
It's this idea, for me, it's this idea of there used to be friction in our lives. And that was good, friction and resistance. It was difficult to figure out what was playing at the movies. You had to get a newspaper. You had to look up what was playing. You had to go down. Now it's like, I can just pull it out of my pocket. And do I want to see it or do I want to watch it on my TV? Our lives are really frictionless. They're smooth.
And I think, when I think about the other impacts of having no technology in the time that I write about, I always think about, a second book. Lane was effectively being kidnapped winter night.
Yeah.
And, outcome is she's on the road in the middle of nowhere with a pregnant woman. And, she lived on her city. They've got to decide,
figure it out.
Closer to go to this community or this one, because we're going to have to walk. It's nighttime, it's snowing. We have to get somewhere where there might be a telephone. There's no guarantee there'll be a telephone.
Right. But at least they'll be inside.
But at least it'll be inside. Yeah. And, that kind of a challenge, I think, just builds your ability to cope a bit more. You're right. Everything's so smooth now.
I was calling it the Apple Store. Our whole lives are just the Apple Store now, right? And it's like, it was, friction's good, right? Friction is what causes heat. Heat's life, friction's a good thing, right? It's
building capacity.
Right, exactly. And the less you challenge those muscles, they soften, right? And so it's.
I mean, you look at the children of Kingscope. There's 3 of them, right? There's just 3 boys. Angela's 3 boys. They're out of the house all the time, doing whatever. Yeah. But when you think about the skills they're building, in a way, they're like little animals who play fight.
Sure.
They're building skills for adulthood, And, I look around at kids.
I feel bad for them. I feel really bad for them.
What are we building here? You know? That's remarkable.
But you had mentioned something about your mother being kind of the inspiration for Lane. And I'm curious, what do you think you inherited from her personally? And then also, what do you think Lane kind of inherited from your mom around how women navigate spaces where they're maybe not fully trusted or fully seen?
My mother was definitely a larger than life person. She came from a fairly upper class background, and so she felt herself belonging everywhere. I always tell the story of her hitchhiking to Alaska when I was 3 and taking a little valise with an evening gown in. And she wore that evening gown to social events in Anchorage with a pair of runners. But her definite belief was, I set the fashion here.
Right.
So she had a very strong sense of belonging wherever she was. And, was I embarrassed by her as a child? It's hard to know. That wasn't your question. It just came to me.
I love that question. I think all children are embarrassed by their parents. Right. It's only in retrospect that you're like, oh, actually, they were a human. They weren't. Yeah.
I did. As my life has changed and I've taken on different roles and first I worked in a kind of service realm, and then I became a teacher. and became an administrator, and then I retired and became a writer. Like in each of those things, I was conscious of having to grow into that role and be comfortable because it was going to involve other people. You know, you're not a teacher without involving other people. So I'd get comfortable with that, and then I'd be into the next. There's a whole new realm of comfort that you have to have. And so I think in some ways I did learn from her that I can belong everywhere, which I think is important. I'm not sure I felt like that all my life.
Of course.
Because she was huge in my life, and you know, you didn't feel like there was much room.
Sure. Yeah.
But now I do feel that I've got. In some ways, it's sort of outright thievery, but I've taken a lot of my mother's life and given it to Lane because I think it makes the kind of woman Lane is and that my mother was. In some ways, they're very, very different. Like everybody responds to ill treatment as a child differently. My mother's was to never really develop super maternal instincts. You know, she was a great and interesting mother, but she wasn't, you know, she never knew where we were. Kind of thing. Whereas Lane is a much more sensible person, and she's discovered late in life that she adores children. She had no idea.
Right.
And so I'm not sure my mother ever got her kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right? I think a level of confidence maybe. And my mother was crazy courageous. You know, my father said about her after she was the most courageous woman and her father had called her a little coward. She and her father did not get along. And, you know, she told me, literally on her deathbed, that she'd spent her whole life trying to prove him. And, you know, I have to look back on things my father did and just say, never. I never inherited that kind of courage. You know. But I think Lane has it, so she's welcome to it.
Right. Yeah. It's an interesting thing, you know, the way you're describing that sort of like that belief of belonging. I think that really encapsulates a kind of behavior that I was just talking about this the other day, about this idea of the exact same trait in someone from one perspective can be inspiring and positive and nurturing and beautiful. And then from the exact same behavior, exact same person, but from a different angle is like this most toxic, awful person. How dare they be here? You know?
That speaks to the resilience of kids. I mean, you know, I've had kids my whole life, and I saw many tragic family situations, and you would see kids coming out of them differently. And some kids had just a little more resilience and were able to, you know, to make it.
I think building on that too is this idea of, you know, there's always going to be somebody who's perceiving you in the wrong. You know what I mean? And so it's like, I think the ability to hold yourself with your own confidence and the ability to, you know, like your mother, to be able to just say, yeah, absolutely, I belong here. Why would I not? Right? You know, there's going to be somebody who says, how dare you? But what does it matter? Like,
her response would be, how dare you?
So Kings Cove, you know, as we've kind of talked about, it really functions in a lot of ways as its own character. You know, it's a place that holds people together, kind of whether they like it or not. And you had mentioned that you grew up somewhere like this. Do you think it takes a certain kind of smallness, I guess is maybe the word for it, you know, the sort of the small community? Do you think it takes that kind of size to really force or to hold genuine connection? Or do you think it's possible on a, you know, Vancouver scale or a larger scale than that?
It's a very interesting question because in some ways, we're more isolated in a bigger place, right? Because we're not, I mean, I live in a small apartment building with like 9 people, 9 different units. And, you know, we're very friendly with each other, but I wouldn't call us a community necessarily because we don't do the things that create community, you know, except around the building.
You say hi in the hallway kind of thing.
Or, hallway, and we work together to get... And I sometimes find myself longing for whatever a small community would give me. And then I think about for about 10 minutes and go, I could... Because the thing about the city is you have so much available to you. And you create community in different kinds of ways. Like I live in a neighborhood, the Dunbar neighborhood. You know, there's 2 drugstores there. There's a movie theater. There's the Stong supermarket. I know everybody. You know, I go in, we always have a chat. of thing. And, you go home feeling like, this is my community. I just have my chat. All the people I know. My neighbors go in and out of there, and we'll stop in front of the spaghetti and annoy people who need to get at the place done, So I think those are different kinds of communities that people make. I'm really lucky because my son and his wife live here in Vancouver, so I've been lucky to have my grandchildren nearby. They're grown men now, so I don't know when I'll see them again.
Of course,
but that was like a real blessing for me because I think like my mother, grew up very isolated, alone because we traveled all the time. From the time I was 5, we traveled all the time. So in a year, I could go to 5 different schools. Right? Yeah. So in some ways, I recognize who my mother was. I was also brought up in that kind of isolated way. My brother never lived with us from the time I was about 5 years old. He stayed here and went to private school because he was older than me. We've just got to know each other much later. Yeah. My father was always away. My mother was always busy. And it was just, there's where that resilience maybe gets built up. And lucky that I had a level of, curiosity. I think my ability to get along with people is because you have to. When you're moving all the time, you have to. Yeah. Right. And so,
well, it's that thing of, there's that instinct to be alone, but the human, whatever we are, the human monkey, right? Like we're not a single, we're a communal animal, right? We have to be connected.
I'm so glad you brought up the human monkey because I think we're so instinctively about making community.
That's right.
It's just going to look different. Big city, small town, all of that.
So to you, it's not necessarily proximity by like where you're living per se, like where your bed is, right? But it's still an in-person connection kind of. Is that where you go with it?
You have to make a bigger effort.
Yeah.
I have to make a bigger effort to go. And I just think about kids growing up in the city. Like I remember, I lived in Mexico City when I was really small. And, and I had a couple of Mexican friends who lived in the building I lived in. But other than went away to school and you went to your dance lessons all over the city. You make your community instinctively. I don't think you do anything special, but I think a community where you're doing this can be really helpful.
There's one of the sort of like tentpole questions of Friendless has been over the years has been this question, because we use these words, right? We use friend, we use community, right? And these are really commonly used words, but they're also very nebulous, right? And they're sort of like, what does that even actually mean? And something I often like to ask my guests is, at the baseline, what does a word like community actually mean to you? So I'm curious, from your sort of perspective, how would you personally define what a community actually is?
You don't ask easy questions. I do think of Vancouver as I definitely do. I think of Dunbar as a village. It is kind of all those communities, I think of mentally in my mind, break the city into all these different communities. And I do literally feel like I'm going to the village if I walk over to Kerrisdale from here.
Yeah.
Or if I drive to Strathcona.
Well, because they were their own villages, right? That's, yeah.
So that's kind of, I think, for me, it's probably for everybody. But this is kind of.
I love that. And actually, your books also take a real honest look at the question of who doesn't belong in communities at times. The outsiders, the marginalized, the sort of the suspicious newcomers, the Americans, right? In your perspective, do you, and this is obviously not like, a mindful choice, but I'm curious at the baseline, do you perceive the concept of Kings Cove as sort of a utopian sort of direction, or is it a more honest portrayal of how communities actually work?
It's fun. Like, there's been a discussion about whether my books are cozy, right?
Which I see as one of the highest accolades, just so you know. I love a cozy ending.
But, in my head, all of the people behind the book that exist are decent people. They may be under duress for whatever reason. I feel like most people you meet are decent people who are trying.
Yeah.
It's the 1940s, and, the Japanese have been moved into that area a lot from the coast. And the Duke of Wars are there, and they're in the middle of a political transition that's already beginning with Sons of Freedom blowing things up, and all of that. Like, it really puts pressure on the community at large.
Yeah.
I think about my mother. My mother spoke many languages. She spoke Russian, and she had Duke of War friends. And she could go and she could speak to people. So maybe not everybody could have, but she was someone in Kings Cove, and so she's example about acceptance, really. Now, the one thing that I noted that, for example, there's a Black police officer, sort of for the first time in Nelson, right? And, some people are just, he's notable because he looks different from other people, but lots of people just roll with that. But in Kings Cove itself, I think because it's a small community and you can't hide who you are in lots of ways, you really can't. You can't go around pretending to be something. I think if you were really appalling to somebody who came in and was vastly different, like your neighbors would call you.
It's hard to hide in any small town. I've lived in a town of 100 people, and it's everybody. Yeah. Everybody knows exactly what's going on everywhere.
You can't pretend to be something. Yeah. Like, if you do, because it's small, you get a certain number where now if you're excluding someone, you've got other people who will do that as well. Right. But in a really small community, that's just like this work. And given who the people are, I'm sure they'd be down there saying, what you're doing is okay.
I'm curious, you started writing much later, right? After decades of being a teacher, also social work and all the rest. And I'm curious, firstly, around the writing, what did the timing of this, of you coming to writing later in your career, what do you think it gave you that you wouldn't have had at an earlier time?
Well, it's very effectively kept me from having to play. We'll say that.
Thank God.
I always wanted to be a writer. And in my 40s, I took a degree at UBC, which was creative writing. So it was always in the background. And I think writing has given me is just like, in a way, a whole new life. Like I consider myself now to be working. I talk about, I'm retired since 2014. I'm working. And I'm meeting just like all kinds of, on a very kind of practical level, many of the writers that I read before I was a writer, Donna Leon, Anne Cleves, Jance, Tony Hillerman's daughter, Anne, Elizabeth George. I've met these people. I've panels with them. Jacqueline Winspear, I was on a panel with her. We talked a lot afterwards, I'm suddenly vaulted into this world of writers that I love. And now I'm kind of with them. And, you have to pinch yourself. So in some ways, it's really, it's opened up a whole new feature of my life.
Do you think that that's kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of like, it revealed to you that authors are just people too, right? Do authors deserve the pedestal, I think maybe is the question.
It's funny, because I do put authors on the pedestal. I absolutely do. But in some ways now, if I can do it, is it worth belonging to this kind of a feeling, like. The other thing I've been really lucky about, and I do pinch myself about this, is that the very first moment I sat down to write the first book, I was still working then. I still had 2 years on my job, and I was working every morning a little bit, before I went to work. Lane just walked into my life. She walked into my life, and there she was. And it's been easy in the sense that it's been the right thing.
Yeah.
That I feel in some ways that these stories were waiting. I got to do, So in some ways, I feel that it is a magical thing, and just incredibly grateful to be part of it.
Yeah. You literally just answered my last question already. I was going to say, you've written 13 books in the series, which means really living with these characters for a long time, and I'm curious, has Lane taught you anything about yourself that you maybe didn't expect?
I think in some ways, people are always asking me, I always begin with my mother was the inspiration, and a lot of things that have happened to me or how she's handled really difficult, dangerous situations are taken directly from things I know about my mother's life because I was alive when some of these things happened. Other things I don't know, and she didn't tell me till she was a year from her. For example, that she did espionage, intelligence gathering. So, when I have to answer the question is Lane like me? I think more and more as I've given voice and a place for all the things I feel strongly about. And, those are social justice issues, how kids are treated. These are huge things for me. But I think they've put meat on the bones of what it actually means, to be fair, to care for children.
I think that's wonderful. This has been just such a pleasure to chat with you. Look, we've had the biggest crowd yet. This is amazing, right? Well, that is Iona Wishaw, everyone. False and Fatal Claim is out now. You'll be able to pick it up at the Book Warehouse where we recorded this conversation. Always support the Book Warehouse. Thank you all so much for coming. I cannot thank this bookstore enough for the partnership. It's incredible for the listeners. If this episode resonated with you, and I really hope it did. And hey, for all the live audience as well, best thing you can do to help the show out is share it when it comes out, especially to someone who you're not suspicious of. But otherwise, thank you so much, and thank you all so much for joining. And I have no official sign off, so I always end up just kind of like trailing off and just saying, and we stop recording here.